right, hello and good evening. Coming to you here from Westminster Presbyterian Church Social Hall. We are in the second week of entering the Passion of Jesus, which is, we started last week with John. This book is written by Amy Jill Levine, who is a scholar who is Jewish, who teaches on the New Testament, which is kind of an interesting combination of things. And I think that we can gain a new perspective from her by looking at the Jewishness of Jesus and of the Passion Week. So last week from John, we talked about Christ knew the risk he was taking when he entered Jerusalem. He threatened each group, the religious groups, the politicians. Everything he did was conscious and purposeful, and he knew the risk he was taking. And we're going to see that again tonight in the temple. I'm going to read from Mark, but this story also happens in Matthew and Luke, the other synoptic gospels. But it actually happens in John as well, only it happens at the beginning of his ministry. It happens right after he turns the water into wine at Cana. He goes to the temple. So it's a very different feel. It's not as threatening because not much is known of him yet. So we won't be talking as much about that tonight. We're going to focus on the story that happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, primarily in Mark. So we're going to be reading Mark 11 through 18. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. We're going to skip the part about the fig tree, down to verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." I think this is a story we've heard many times. I would compare it almost to Jonah or Daniel in the lion's den in terms of stories we teach children, especially during Easter and Palm Sunday. I feel like I remember coloring pictures of Jesus flipping over the tables. So you're probably comfortable with the story. You've heard it many times. But like I said, we're going to look at a new perspective from this author who is Jewish. I think the first thing we need to do is to look at the temple itself. And I know if you're viewing this at home, you probably can't see this too well because I'm looking at a video screen and you can kind of just see the colors. So I'll try to show you the general areas. But this is the temple complex. And this is Herod's temple. And it was huge. It was the size of 12 soccer fields. And I was thinking about that today, 12 soccer fields. I took Winnie to Ridgeview Park, and over the river there's those soccer fields, and there's a series of them, but it's certainly not 12. It's a smaller number than that. So if you are familiar with that area, I think it's even bigger than that. It's a huge area. So Jesus, as a Jewish man, he could have entered the area, and upon entering, he would have gone through a series of courts. The first court would have been the Court of Gentiles. Anyone is allowed here. Jewish, Gentile, anyone is allowed there. He would have then passed a sign as he went through there in Greek, warning non-Jews that they would be put to death if they passed that area. Then he would enter the Court of Women, which was the last place women were allowed. They couldn't go past that point. And then up some stairs, there was a gate. Then it was to only the ritually purified Jewish men. Then beyond that were the priests. Then was the Holy of Holies, which of course is only where the high priest was allowed once a year on Yom Kippur into the Holy of Holies. So each area, I believe, went higher and higher. I believe it was kind of the steps up to the highest point on the Holy of Holies, I think, from what I had determined in my archaeological research this week. So all this to say, this was huge. When I was a child and I imagined Jesus in the temple throwing over the tables, I imagined like a tiny little chapel, almost like Red Door upstairs, and then everyone stopped and watched him, and they're like, what's this guy doing? And then everyone saw it. Not really. He was somewhere in the Court of Gentiles, so he could have been over here, and people over here, it was loud, there was a lot of people there they might not have known. I'm sure they heard about it later, but it didn't disrupt the whole temple. It was more a symbolic gesture. Now, of course, up here, you had the Antonia Tower, which is where the Romans had a citadel. So they would have seen him on purpose. Knowing what we know last week about Jesus' actions, quite possibly. Maybe I shouldn't conjecture, but I am. So the guards took note. What did it symbolize then, his actions? If it was not to disrupt the whole temple and have everyone stop and look, why? Well, to understand that, we need to further understand the role of the temple for Jewish people. So today, depending on where you live, you may have multiple synagogues in your community. Where I grew up, we had, I'm not really sure, 3 to 5 synagogues in my town, in my community. I had Jewish friends who, when they would go, they would say they were going to temple. That's how they refer to it, to their synagogue. When we say going to church, going to temple. But going to temple in Jesus' time was just one. It was just one temple. There were not multiple temples. First century historian Josephus said, one temple for the one God. At Jesus' time, one God was rare. So the Jews really kind of latched on to that idea that they had one God. You had the Canaanites worshiping multiple gods, which had gotten them into some trouble in the past. You had the Babylonian gods with their strong ties to the Greek gods and astrology. And the Babylonians would have a temple in each city with a guardian god for that city. Then you have the Greek gods that we know, Zeus, Athena. And then in the Roman Empire, there was the Greco-Roman gods. And that is what we have architecturally the examples of their temples that they built to their gods. We have some still really standing well. So the Jews felt they were very unique in their one God. This added to the power of the temple, they felt, that there was just one. It was the most sacred place to them. We talked about how this was built up higher, the Holy of Holies. They felt it was where earth rose and heaven descended so they could touch. Temple was 4 things. It was a house of prayer. When Jews were praying, they were supposed to pray towards Jerusalem. If they were in Jerusalem, they were supposed to pray towards the temple. If they were somewhere in the temple complex praying, they were to pray in the direction of the Holy of Holies. 2, this was the site of 3 pilgrimage festivals. I was working on the pronunciation of this earlier, and my kids are like, what are you listening to? The Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot. That's not right. Shavuot, maybe. So 3 times a year, in Deuteronomy 16:16, God says, 3 times a year shall all your men appear before the Lord your God in the place that God will choose. On the Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. They shall not appear empty-handed. Each shall bring his own gift appropriate to the blessing which the Lord your God has given you. That was from Deuteronomy. So those 3 times, Passover, Pentecost, and the Festival of Booths, I'm not going to try to say in Hebrew again, they had to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. No matter where they were making that pilgrimage. 3, it was a cultural center of tradition. Jerusalem had around 100 to 200,000 people living in it around Jesus' time. For these festivals, the size of the city would swell to 1 million. So the city had to take in account for that. You're in a really dry place. They had to have water coming in for the ritual baths. They had to have places for people to sleep. They had to have food. It's like a destination. It's like the beach. They had to be prepared for it. And number 4, it was the only place where sacrifices could be offered. A sacrifice, the Torah commands the sacrifice. It requires a renunciation of a belonging, of an animal belonging to you. It could not be a wild animal. Or if it was a grain, flour, or meal, because those took more work to prepare. The sacrifice was a substitution for the sin, and it was meant to bring the person offering the sacrifice closer to God. So those were the things that the temple existed for. The house of prayer, the site of the pilgrimage festivals, a cultural center, and where sacrifices could be offered. All right, so let's look at what Jesus did. In Luke 2, we learn that Mary and Joseph went to offer doves after Christ's birth. Doves was the traditional offering after a birth. Also in Luke 2, we skip ahead in time a little bit and learn that Jesus travels with his parents to the temple for Passover and is left behind. This kind of made me think of Home Alone at Christmas time, when Kevin is forgotten in the mad rush. The family's getting ready to go to Paris, and the extended family is there. There are a lot of relatives. There are a lot of kids. It's a joyous celebration. No one really seems joyous in Home Alone, but it's a joyous Christmas time. But Passover was a joyous time. Families were gathering together. They would travel together to Jerusalem, and unlike Kevin, who was setting up booby traps for the robbers, Jesus is at his father's house when his parents find him. He's learning from the priest. But he'd been misplaced in the air of excitement with the families all around. So we can imagine what the temple was like around the Passion Week. It was crowded. The author tells us that the Court of Gentiles, animals were sold for sacrifice, so that the Jews would not have to travel with the animals. It was a long pilgrimage for some, and it would be inconvenient to travel with an animal, is the explanation that she gave us. So she defends the practice and says it wasn't actually a problem, although she doesn't really give us a reason then that Jesus was upset about it. But other commentaries I read say that selling animals for sacrifice makes the sacrifice impersonal. And that's something that makes sense to me, because I think about Matthew teaches agriculture, and he has had a student a couple of years ago who was raising a steer for the auction, for the youth auction off the cattle. And she had raised it since it was a baby, and she was very attached to it. And obviously somebody was going to buy it and eat it. That's what they're for. And even though she knew this, the entire time she was raising it, she was in tears when she sold it. And that was the point. The point was to sell it. And she needed the money to pay for everything. It was expensive. But you become attached to this animal. And I think that if I just go and I just, buy some meat at the grocery store, I don't know that cattle. I'm not that attached to it. I'm sorry if you're listening and you're a vegetarian. But I think, is it as meaningful to go to the temple, to the Court of Gentiles, which is where they were sold, and just buy a sacrifice? Perhaps if you don't have a lot of money, that's meaningful to have to spend the money, but I think that it does take away some of the meaning. It wasn't just Caiaphas that was allowing this. The priests, the people, not as many people were arguing with the fact that they were selling animals here. It was kind of going unchecked. The author also defends the moneylenders, saying that it was necessary. The pilgrims were coming from many places with Greek money or Roman money that needed to be exchanged for Jewish money. So she says that they needed to do it. They had to pay the temple tax. They had to buy their animals for sacrifice. It was convenient to have here in the Court of Gentiles these money exchanges. Kind of like when you buy candy or popcorn at the movie theater, or you go to an ATM that's not at your bank, you pay a fee. When you buy candy at the movie theater, it's $5. You buy it at the gas station, it's $1. So you're paying for convenience. Okay? Is it permissible? Yes. It's legal, but sometimes it nags at you. Why are they making so much money off of me? Well, the temple, they were also making money because they were making a fee, kind of an exchange rate. So he was frustrated, but I think still this isn't the bigger picture. This is just part of it. So according to the gospel, Mark tells us that Jesus entered the temple upon entering Jerusalem on his first day. He rides the donkey and he goes and looks around. It doesn't say, it just says he looked around at everything. So what does he take in? I think he comes in and he's taking in the money changers, the stalls, and the crowds of people that were using the temple as just a way to get from one side of the city to the other. They might have been shopping over here and their home was over there. They were just using it as a cut through. They weren't even at the temple to worship. So he took in all of these things. So Jesus is standing in the court of the Gentiles when he overturns the tables and drives out the moneylenders. It is there that he quotes Isaiah 56:7. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. It's worth noting that Mark is writing in Rome primarily to Gentile Christians. Matthew, who's writing primarily to Jews, leaves out the for all nations part. Although Luke, who was also writing to a Gentile audience, left out the for all nations part, so there might be nothing to that. But that is a difference between the different synoptic gospels. But it's true that God's desire was that his temple be used for all his people. So it could be interpreted that Jesus felt that it was interrupting Israel's witness to the world for the court of Gentiles to be misused in that way. It wasn't being used for Gentiles to come and worship in their own way. It was being used to sell animals and exchange money. So if the temple was a sprawling, huge complex, and Jesus' actions didn't interrupt everything, and going about, so why was he mad? Why did he show a most violent anger? If money changing was necessary to pay the temple tax, why did Jesus drive him out with a whip? People had become cavalier. Jesus was frustrated with what his father's house had been made. All of these issues represented the position of the heart of the people. Lent is a period of atonement. It's a time when we make right our wrongs in preparation for Easter. We are to look inside ourselves and to personally, what do we need to do for that reconciliation? So let's look at the different issues Jesus had and what the bigger picture was behind each. So Mark takes care to mention that the temple is a house for all nations. What about our church? Is our church for all people, or is it just for the people that look like us, walk like us, and talk like us? How do people feel when they visit our church? One of the reasons my family chose Westminster when we first moved here was because of how welcomed I felt before I even stepped in the building. I was in the parking lot. I was carrying Louie, who was a toddler at the time, and I was flagged down by Debbie Layton. And she said, "Hi, hello, welcome. Do you need any help finding the nursery?" I was like, "As a matter of fact, I do. I've never been here." And she had Tanner, who was like a couple months old at the time, and Brooke and Rachel, and she said, "Let me show you there." And she was so friendly and welcoming, and I know that she has served this same role for other people on their first visit to the church. She's made people feel welcome. But what if you came here and you didn't run into Debbie? Are we all Debbie to our visitors? Or do we come in and sit down, listen to April, and leave? Do we give someone a dirty look if they're in our seat? Now, during COVID, there's lots of seats to choose from. If you're here in person, when we pass the peace, do we reach for the hands of the people we know? Or do we try to look and see, is there someone here that I've never seen before, and go over to them and make them feel welcome? Because if you have ever been a guest in a church, you probably know that it feels good when someone comes over to you and knows that you have not been there before. 2 Chronicles 6. This is what Solomon said while dedicating his temple to the Lord. "Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays toward this house, hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house I have built is called by your name." So Solomon in his dedication of the temple, has a portion to non-Jews to be welcomed in the temple. When Jesus referred to the current status of the temple as a den of robbers, he was not calling the people there thieves. A den of robbers, and this was interesting that the author pointed it out because I had never thought of it. I don't know why. A den of robbers is not where robbers go to rob. And that's what I always thought. I thought it's where the robbers are. He's calling them robbers. No. A den of robbers is where the robbers go after they have stolen something and they go and count up their loot. Using den of robbers, Jesus is referencing Jeremiah 7, 9 through 10. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? The author notes that people in Jeremiah's time, people in Jesus' time, and people now take God's mercy for granted. Her present-day example was those who act one way during the week and then come to church on Sunday, singing hymns, shaking hands, giving money. She said, this is what makes the church a den of robbers, a meeting place of the unrepentant. Again, it's that position of the heart. After working on tonight's lesson throughout the past week, I was reading back through my notes last night, and I was praying that God would reveal to me anything else that was important. I didn't want to miss the point that I needed to convey. And then I was curious about the difference between Solomon's temple, because I had been doing that research, the first temple, and Herod's temple, the second temple. I was curious of the differences between the two, and if that would shed more light on Jesus' anger, because I still felt like I was missing something, because the author acted like he shouldn't be that angry. I was confused. I thought, I want to know. So in reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I was struck by God's presence and hand in the building of Solomon's temple. From God telling David that his son, not he, would build a temple, to specific instructions that he gave. In 1 Chronicles 28:19, all this, David said, I have in writing from the hand of the Lord upon me, and he gave me understanding in all the details of the plan. God laid it out, what the temple should look like, Solomon's temple, that is. Then on the other hand, you have Herod building the temple, not because he was instructed by God, but because, as Josephus tells us, he wanted to perpetuate his name. He wanted to build something grand that people would remember him by. The other main difference was the presence of God in the temple. When Solomon finished the temple and dedicated it to the Lord, it says, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled it. There is no scripture or extra-biblical Jewish literary evidence of God's presence dwelling in Herod's temple like he had in Solomon's. It is only when Jesus is in the temple that God is present there, in the form of his son. In Matthew 12:7, he says, one greater than the temple is here. John 1:14, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Rather than God dwelling in the temple, we had Christ, which many of the temple failed to recognize. All right, let's pray. Almighty God, let us not fail to recognize the King, the Word made flesh. Let us make his presence known in our lives and the center of everything we do. Position our hearts so that he is present in our church, in our actions at home and at work. May the good work we do be in his name and not in our own name. Amen. All right. Thank you, and please join us next week for Tammy McKibben, and she will be talking about risking challenge.